A very good evening to one and all of you, and we shall be we just have an hour to do all the magic in cornea and refractive, and I don't know. That's why I thought I'll catch the train myself. So we have, I don't know, Dr. Mahipal hasn't joined it. Dr. Namrata, I did see her, our very prominent honorary secretary, and probably her Rajesh Sinha might join us. I do not see Dr. Rajesh Fogla. I hope he has joined, and of course Gaurav Luthra, who's the chairman of ISI, is with us, and my co-moderator is Dr. Anaga Harur, who is going to inject as much enthusiasm in this 1 hour time which we have. So if Dr. Namrata is there, we go on to our first talk with Namrata, who's going to be talking on intrastromal antifungal injections when and where. Dr. Namrata?
Ma'am, I think they would be at AIMS for the function.
Okay, no.
She has gone for the inauguration.
Yes,
yeah,
ma'am.
she was,
I
saw her there. We shall go on to our next speaker, Dr. Rishi Swaroop, who would be talking on managing recurrent superficial punctate keratitis in adenovirus conjunctivitis. On to you, Dr. Rishi. Dr. San, you will be after that.
Hello, Dr. Chitra. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful ARC symposium. And it's my privilege to present this topic, which is being given to me is recurrent adenoviral keratitis, how to manage the subdural infiltrates. So as we all know, adenoviruses are a group of viruses which cause epidemic keratoconjunctivitis and pharyngoconjunctival fever. The serotypes 8, 19, and 37 are the ones that specifically affect the eye. And they are highly contagious and spread by fomites mainly. Incubation period is about a week. So presentation, initially there is an acute presentation followed by a chronic presentation. In the acute stage, it presents with, can somebody mute the person speaking? So conjunctival hyperemia, just like a regular conjunctivitis, but these patients often present with very severe congestion, chemosis, lid edema, and you can have pseudo membranes, etc. in the initial stages. And this may or may not be accompanied by systemic upper respiratory kind of a presentation, fatigue, preauricular lymphadenopathy. Now, this stage of conjunctivitis usually lasts between 1 to 2 weeks and then usually resolves. But what causes the real problem in these patients is when this starts affecting the cornea. So you can have corneal presentation in the initial stage as an epithelial punctate keratitis, but it goes on to become coarse SPKs and then subepithelial infiltrates, which cause the problem. And that's basically the one which we are going to talk about today. So the epithelial keratitis goes through 4 stages. Initially, you have diffuse fine kind of PEs, which may even involve the entire cornea. You can even have an epithelial defect happening in some of these patients. This usually presents in the first case, the first week of the presentation, and it is mainly accompanied by viremia. So the virus is the actual cause of this set of epithelial keratitis. But subsequent stages of the epithelial keratitis, stage 2 to stage 4, are actually because of a delayed hypersensitivity reaction to the epithelial viral antigens. So the stage 2 is when you start seeing those whitish focal punctate lesions in the epithelium, and the SPKs tend to become more coagulated, kind of large coarse SPKs is what you see at this stage. Immediately to 1 or 2 days after this, you start seeing subepithelial infiltrates beneath these epithelial lesions, and that is the stage 3. And by this stage, the conjunctivitis starts to resolve, and this happens by about 2 to 3 weeks. And then after that, you start developing only subepithelial infiltrates without any epithelial changes. So the lesion is now moved basically subepithelially. And this starts at about 3 to 4 weeks and may persist for months or even years in these patients. And this is the stage 4 is what is the focus of this talk today. So you can have various presentations of these subepithelial infiltrates. You can have few focal infiltrates.
And the timer be on?
Yeah, it's on, ma'am. Few focal infiltrates which may be peripheral, and those are really not very important. And they usually resolve without causing any visual problems. So if you have a few peripheral subepithelial infiltrates which are not involving the vision, one would suggest that you should just ignore these and let these resolve spontaneously. But if they start coming in the visual axis, they can be severely affecting the vision, and they are of course seen as these fluffy subepithelial infiltrates with fuzzy borders, which are whitish, grayish white in color. And they may persist for a long time, even up to years, as I mentioned. So the eventual outcome is either they will disappear spontaneously or they will end up with scarring, because and scarring is essentially the long-standing inflammation. And why do they persist for years? It's basically the viral antigen or viral particles which are persisting intracellularly, which is going on causing a persistent delayed hypersensitivity, which presents as these subepithelial infiltrates. So diagnosis is of course largely clinical, but we do have diagnostic options available like the RT-PCR, and now internationally we have these AdenoPlus, which is a rapid antigen test, which is available with high sensitivity and specificity, but they're not available here. The same company has a rapid antigen test for dry eye, which is called the Inflammar Dry, but they don't have this here. And of course, one can also check the IgM antibody titers. So this was a very interesting publication by Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, which showed that ASOCT can actually help you differentiate an active subepithelial infiltrate from a scar. So you can see these kind of hyperreflective lesions in the subepithelial area, but if they are very well defined, that's a scar. But if you have like a ill-defined borders, that indicates that these are subepithelial infiltrates. So management, one important thing to remember is there's no role for antibiotics. Mainstay of treatment is supportive. There is some evidence to suggest that if you give topical povidone iodine in the initial stages, it may prevent subepithelial infiltrates from coming in later. So that has some role. Unfortunately, that's not available in the Indian market. Topical steroids do have a role in subepithelial infiltrates. I'll just come to that. Other controversial drugs are antivirals like ganciclovir. We don't have clear-cut evidence they work. And other anti-inflammatories like cyclosporin and tacrolimus. Now, steroids are very important. They do have a controversial role. Now I'll take one more minute. I can't.
I would request you to please conclude in 30 seconds because we are already late.
Okay, I'll conclude in 30 seconds. So the controversial role of steroids is because if you give it, it may end up causing recurrences. So give only when it's necessary. So if you can avoid giving steroids, if it's not in the visual axis, the vision is okay, the peripheral infiltrates, avoid steroids. But if they are involving the central vision, then you can give them, but then you have to do a very, very slow taper. Otherwise, you will have recurrences. And of course, in the initial, very acute presentation, sometimes you do need to give steroids for comfort, but you should be giving only a short pulse. Don't give a prolonged dose unless it's necessary. So I give a very slow taper over 6 to 8 months. And if I start steroids, I will taper it very slowly. If you just give a month, 4, 3, 2, 1 kind of taper, it will recur in all probability, and that's not a good idea. So this topical povidone that we need to use is actually a very low concentration, which is commercially not available in India. So you could dilute and use it. But I have not personally used it, but I think if the companies can make it, this would certainly help to reduce recurrences. And there have been papers which have shown that very nicely. So other topical immunosuppressants which can be used are topical cyclosporin and tacrolimus. These are especially useful as steroid-sparing agents. Especially if patients are having steroid response, you can use these for a long term. And they can help to supplement the action of steroids. So to conclude, avoid steroids until indicated, do a very slow taper. Topical povidone iodine may have a role, and along with topical cyclosporin and tacrolimus. But having said all said and done, it is a difficult condition to treat because it tends to keep recurring, and the key is to taper very slowly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rishi. I would want, I'm sorry, Dr. San, Sujata has to go to another room, so I have to get her connected. And one question to Dr. Rajesh Fogla here. Do you feel there is any role of PTK with mitomycin C in those situations? Sujata, you could share your screen. Do you feel there's any role for PTK with MMC to reduce glare or any visual
That would be
symptoms?
for inactive lesions when there is scarring involving the visual axis and leading to a lot of glare. In that scenario, yes, doing a PTK combined with mitomycin definitely helps improve the vision. But one should make sure that the lesions are, they have very sharply defined margins and not, so they are not active. So maybe an anterior segment OCT can help in that regard.
Even that, I would suggest that we should wait for at least 4 to 6 months before we go ahead. If they're recently scarred.
This is done at least a year, or because we first give a trial of steroids to see whether we can mitigate that just by using topical medications. And if it's not resolving and the scars are there in the visual axis, because the cornea really modulates itself,
Yes.
the healing process, and does improve the vision. So it's not definitely the first choice, but this should be the last resort. When you don't have an option, then you can think about doing it.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajesh. I'm so sorry
Excuse
for
me.
interrupting.
I know that. Please, I don't want you to keep coming in. I would go on to introduce Dr. Sujata Mohan. I'm not actually introducing you all because we are quite stressed about the time. And she's going to give us her preferred practice guidelines for a big bubble versus manual DALK. I wouldn't want you to interfere at all. I'm very conscious of the time. Just keep the timer on, please.
Thank you, Chitra, and thank you, Scientific Committee, for giving me this opportunity. So big bubble technique was popularized by Dr. Mohammed Anwar and involves injecting air in the deep stroma using a 27 gauge needle. This creates a separation of the posterior stroma from the descemetes, and the pathological cornea is replaced where the descemetes and the endothelium is retained. It has a steep learning curve, but the good visual outcome is as comparable to a PK. And the most great advantage is a low risk of rejection. So now some of these conditions are common to both big bubble and manual DALK. So I'm not going into this. The advantage of DALK is it's an extraocular procedure, less intraocular complications. Donor tissue criteria is less stringent. So we are likely to get more tissue for DALK. So this is a case of an advanced keratoconus in which we did a big bubble DALK. The cornea was extremely thin, so I didn't do any superficial keratectomy. After doing a little bit of dissection of the 15 number blade, I've introduced a 30 gauge needle to form the big bubble. And once the big bubble comes, I think the whole process becomes very easy. It's very important that we decompress the eye and release the aqueous as much as possible before de-roofing the bubble. So once you de-roof, you get a nice space between the posterior stroma and the descemetes, and then you can use a blunt-tipped varnish to make multiple cuts along the posterior stroma without damaging the descemetes. It's very important, particularly when you go very close to the edge, to make sure that your varnish does not perforate the descemetes. So this can be done very gently, and you can go all around and remove the bits of tissue that you have dissected, the small pies of tissue that you've dissected, and expose the descemetes. Once you get the descemetes, you can inject air into the anterior chamber, wash out the viscoelastic from the surface, and prepare your graft. Normally, I prefer a same size graft for a DALK, and you remove the endothelium from the graft, and you can suture it. So the most important thing is now what we have seen is a very shiny surface of the descemetes membrane, which perhaps is going to give the best possible vision to the patient. And once this is done, you can see that the same size graft is being sutured, and the whole procedure is complete. So this is a post-operative picture of the same patient after about 3-4 days. So coming to the intraoperative problems that we can face are the perforation during trephination can happen, particularly in very thin corneas, very superficial trephination. You can actually get a type 2 bubble, as you can see in this picture, or when you're de-roofing the bubble, what I did, I punctured twice and I got the aqueous out. So actually what I did was I actually punctured the descemetes. So these are some of the problems that you can face. But the most important thing is that whatever stage that we are in, we should try to avoid converting it into PK and try as much as possible to convert this and to find out the area of the bubble, retain the bubble, and then go and complete the DALK. In this, you can see that I'm suturing the area of the perforation and completing the DALK as much as possible. So let's see what happens. This is a post-op 1 week. You can see the patient's doing well. This patient had a macular dystrophy and had severe photophobia. This is the area of the perforation. So this is again some of my patients pre and post-op, advanced keratoconus, big bubble DALK. This is keratoconus with stromal dystrophy. This is the first patient's picture, the first patient. And this patient had, again, keratoconus with an advanced cone, and tried to get, she had a lot of scars on the cornea, though there was no, there was no hydrops or no hydrop scar, but she had plenty of scarring on the cornea. It was very difficult to get a big bubble. So we continued with the manual dissection. The advantage of this this technique is that if once you probably fine tune it, you'll find that the results are equally good. The most important thing is to go as close to the descendants as possible. You can see here that I'm injecting, but all the it's only producing an emphysema outside. Even after repeated injections, we got the same. Oh, I've got only 1 minute. Okay, I'll move on to the discussion. So manual DALK, the problem is it's very increases the risk of inadvertent penetration. So depth of stromal dissection cannot be visualized during surgery, particularly when there is a scar. So Mellis introduced a 3-step surgical technique where you inject air into the anterior chamber to create an air endothelial interface. These are some of the studies which have shown the biomechanics in DALK, both in big bubble as well as in manual, are equal when they measure the corneal hysteresis and corneal resistance factor, and there is no disadvantage in manual DALK. And clinical results, when you compare with the manual DALK provides comparable results to big bubble. However, the faster visual recovery and better quality of vision is seen when in big bubble DALK. So this is again a study which compared the visual acuity, and they found that the big bubble DALK had a significantly better, best corrected visual acuity. So the visual outcome depends on the depth of the pre-Descemet's layer, and whether it's smoother or regular, and the surface is better. So this is a confocal microscopy. You can see the moderately hyperreflective homogeneous layer in a big bubble DALK, whereas in a pre-Descemetic DALK, it's a non-homogeneous layer. A lot of hyperreflectivity is seen, tissue edema. Therefore, the quality of vision in these patients will definitely be much less. So in conclusion, big bubble technique appears to be the best surgical approach to DALK. Manual dissection should be considered where there is an option to avoid conversion to PK. A surgical goal is to reach the Descemet's. An anterior lamellar keratoplasty in a descemal bed of less than 20 microns can achieve a result very similar to penetrating keratoplasty. So caveat is DALK is preferable to PK. Compromised visual acuity may be a bugbear in manual DALK. Reaching the Descemet's membrane is the ultimate goal. However, in patients with no endothelial disease, DALK should be the option over PK. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sujata. I want one question with Dr. Rajesh, and I would want Dr. San Basu to share the screen. If you get a small central type 1 bubble, how would you enlarge it without perforation, Dr. Rajesh?
Well, if you get a small central bubble and you want to further extend it, I think first you should do a paracentesis and release aqueous to lower the intraocular pressure so the counter pressure is minimized. And then you can go ahead and try injecting more air into the bubble. And if you feel that without too much of resistance, if your bubble can expand, you can then continue injecting air. But despite doing that, if you feel that there is still a lot of resistance, then one should refrain from further injection, because that means that that bubble has reached its limit. And if you continue injecting more air, you may end up rupturing it. So often you expose that bubble and then try and do a manual dissection to separate the residual stroma from the pre-Descemet's layer manually up to the edge of the trepanation.
Thank you very much. There are a lot more questions which could be asked. I think I'll take it on my ARC webinars. Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. And we look forward to hearing Dr. San Basu from LV Prasad, who's going to be telling us on managing refractory allergic eye disease, the preferred practice guidelines. I wouldn't want you to linger on clinical symptoms at all.
Thank you, Dr. Chitra, and for the word of advice. I'll be very quick and very brief. So I'm going to talk about managing recalcitrant, difficult to manage allergic eye disease. It's fairly common. A lot of patients have allergy, particularly young children, and it's estimated that it's about 10% of all children and adolescents have some form of allergic eye disease, mild, moderate, severe. And that's a very, very high number of patients. So you have to be understand that this is very, very common. And, allergy can be a number of ways that allergic eye disease can manifest. Most commonly, as we know in India, it's vernal keratoconjunctivitis, mostly happens in summer. and usually subsides with the onset of the monsoon. And typically it starts in early childhood, which is about 3 to 5 years of age. And a child who gets allergy at that age, if not treated appropriately initially, or if the stimulus is not controlled, then they can have this problem till a very long time, their entire adolescence. So mostly people start between 3 to 11 years of age and can have this problem for between 5 to 10 years. So because of the longevity and the chronic course, a lot of people develop chronic complications, and the allergy can be recalcitrant also to medications that are usually used in terms of topical anti-inflammatory, etc. So although it does not really cause too much of a visual morbidity, it can cause a number of sequelae, especially corneal ectasia. And then you have other problems like corneal scarring, vascularization, limbal stem cell deficiency, particularly medication-related iatrogenic issues like steroid-induced cataract and glaucoma. So there is for these patients the option of systemic prophylaxis using oral steroids, systemic cyclosporin and tacrolimus. And typically for patients who are less than 12 years of age, my preferred treatment for them is the use of oral steroids. Now remember that we are not talking about patients who have come in with very mild allergy or presenting for the first time. These are patients who have had it for many years, have been on topical medications, and are still continuing to progress with severe manifestations and keratopathy. So below 12 years of age, they'll usually be on oral prednisolone 0.5 milligram per kg per day, which is tapered over 6 to 12 months, and tacrolimus eye ointment at HS without any other eye drops or lubricating drops. And above 12 years of age, you keep them on oral prednisolone at the same dose, or give them cyclosporin about 1 to 2 milligram per kg per day, tapered over 6 to 12 months. And again, tacrolimus eye ointment at HS. We usually don't give oral cyclosporin to very young children. So just to give you a few examples, somebody with papillary reaction and symptoms because of these huge macropapillae can resolve very quickly over 3 to 6 months with complete regression and conversion of the macropapillae to micropapillae with systemic treatment. Similarly, someone with severe limbal inflammation can also resolve with complete settling of these lesions. And somebody with significant shield ulcers and scarring, ulceration, necrosis can over a period of time resolve very nicely with very minimal scarring. Now, you also get cases that are, that progress to cause limbal stem cell deficiency. And in these patients, limbal stem cell deficiency can be controlled from progressing by using systemic therapy, and also surgical reconstruction can be attempted. The good thing about allergic eye disease and limbal stem cell deficiency is that they do not have any lid position or abnormalities or lack of thalamus, entropy, and ectropion. They have papillae, but that's all right. Most of them are atrophic. They do not usually have dry eyes. This is reported in literature. And also the underlying stroma is relatively clear. So in these cases, also because you're going to treat eventually with systemic cyclosporin or tacrolimus, that you have to understand is good for allograft rejection prevention, and also directly addresses the disease pathway. So in these patients, we can go ahead with simple limbal epithelial transplantation from a donor. The only difference from a regular surgery is in this case, after putting the amniotic membrane, you will be taking the graft from a cadaveric or a living related donor, and that can then be cut up into small pieces, and the rest of the surgery can progress with fibrin glue as it is done in normal SLED. And because these eyes are wet with normal lid position, and you are going to give inflammation, and the reason we give inflammation is there's so much, give immunosuppression is that there's so much of inflammation. If you can see the top row in these eyes with these inflammatory pannus. So you can convert an eye which is looking like this with systemic immunosuppression surgery to an eye which looks like this. So it works really, really well in patients with severe allergic eye disease and limbal stem cell deficiency. So to conclude, VKC is not always innocuous. It can be chronic, be persistent for several decades, and be potentially blinding. Primary prevention, awareness, education is important. Secondary prevention, we need to address the at-risk population. And then you have medical and surgical therapy for those who have severe recalcitrant disease. And in these, systemic therapy may be vision saving, and systemic therapy in addition to vision restoring surgery like cadaveric or allogenic simple limbal epithelial transplantation can be transformational. Thank you so much.
That was a great talk and a very covered it all. I would want Dr. Vavikar to share. In the interim, I have a question to you, Dr. Saran Basu. When you rarely, extreme situation, when you consider a systemic immunosuppressant, how would you follow up these patients and how long would you keep them on these medications?
Usually with oral steroids, children tolerate it really well. Unlike when you use oral steroids for other indications, typically patients with allergy do not develop Cushingoid symptoms with these mild doses of systemic steroids. And you can keep monitoring them serum calcium and their bone density if you are concerned, or they're just their CBC, and usually they do well. We do systemic evaluation assessment on a regular basis, and you'll be surprised to find how well they're tolerated in comparison to use of systemic steroids in other conditions, particularly in children and adolescents, and how little they cause any kind of systemic disturbance. It almost feels like you're filling in a gap which somehow is there in their systemic condition, that the steroids that you're giving from outside are addressing a vacuum that is there in their biology.
The last question, do you feel there's any role for systemic cyclosporin?
Systemic cyclosporin is also very useful as a steroid sparing agent, and typically I give it in children older than 12 years, adolescents or adults. Adults with allergy, very difficult to treat and to give oral steroids in patients who have onset of allergic eye disease in adulthood. In those cases, and also in adolescents, you can manage very well with oral cyclosporin, particularly in those patients who are undergoing reconstructive surgery for allergy-related ocular surface disease.
Thank you very much, Dr. San.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chitra.
Thank you. We shall go on to our refractive segment. I would want all of you all to stay back, the cornea people. And our first speaker is Dr. Vavikar, who's going to be telling us how he would choose between topo-guided treatment versus wavefront optimized ablation. On to you, doctor.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. No financial interest. So why do we need to understand which ablation profile to choose? Basically, WFO or wavefront optimized will treat only the manifest astigmatism, but topo-guided will treat many micro irregularities on the cornea which are responsible for higher order aberrations and thereby improving the quality. Why? But all this, because there are several sources of astigmatism. Treating only manifest refraction or the cylinder may not be enough. Whenever you can solve the riddle where the astigmatism is coming from, you can handle it by doing topo-G. But when not possible, better to be safe and go for wavefront optimized treatment. Now, wavefront guided treatment was being used, topo-guided treatment was being used for many years before, but as a reparative process. But it used to be a two-step procedure because it used to throw refractive surprise. The moment people realized that the C2-C4 compensation can be, C4-C2 compensation can be done, people started doing it, taking it as a primary procedure. Now, how do you do this C4-C12 compensation? So when you're doing topo-guided treatment, make the refractive error 0 on the workstation, and what will be left with only HO you are treating. Just see how much is the C12. Change the spherical level so that the C4 becomes same as C12. Now, Alcon came with these guidelines that when the difference between the measured cylinder and the refraction cylinder, measured means the topo cylinder, is more than 1.25, diopters don't do wavefront topo-guided treatment. And if the difference between the axis is 5 degrees for cylinder more than 2 or more than 10 degrees for cylinders less than 2, again, don't do topo-guided treatment. But what happened is that these are the patients who actually will be benefited quite a lot. Then there was second sheet like this, that when the amount of cylinder is more in refraction, then you treat only the measured cylinder. But when it is other way around, you go halfway through. That means between refraction and measured, you strike a balance. And then, of course, the next step will be to adjust the spherical equivalent. But somehow this looked logically okay, but there were a lot of cases which were not getting answers for. And then the attention went to what are the major sources of astigmatism in the eye. So number one is the refractive error, of course, and then the topographic irregularities, or we call them talus, then posterior corneal surface, and lenticular astigmatism. Forsitis is the first software who could give mathematical value to this talus or topographic irregularities. And it would combine all these four vectors by vector analysis and come with a what is the treatment plan to be applied when you do topo guided treatment. And it will also adjust for spherical equivalent and very advanced nomogram as compared to simple, which was provided by Alcon, and the calculation is done in 10 seconds. Previously we used to take long time for this, and the results have been far superior with Forcides. So Forcides is the way to go. There is one more software available like this, but I do not have any personal experience with that software. And this is the Forcides thing. You feed in the values here, all the four cylinders, you feed the values, and then this is what the output will be. See, in this particular case, two treatments are recommended. Number one is the Contura or the topo guided, and because it will not read the refractive error, the second treatment goes consecutively, that is the 0.75 cylinder. And believe me, this works really well. Then for complicated cases like FFKC, when you're doing PRK extra, or this is the model, this is the treatment. This patient also did very well, but I would like you to see this case, that this patient, 22-year-old male with a keratoconus grade 2 to 3, his visual acuity base was 618, but by using Forcides and topo guided PRK and C3R, his vision improved to 6/6 partial. Of course, it was along with refraction. We could not get the refraction down to 0, but still he was quite happy. This is the post-op picture of that, and this is the pre-op picture. In the meantime, I had lost my Pentacam. I had to buy MS39, so they're from different machines. But at the same time, you can understand that this treatment and the topo guided treatment along with Forcides is the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Vavekar. Dr. Rajesh, I have a question for you. While Shreyash can share his screen, do you think that the visual outcomes in terms of glare and contrast is significantly better with the topo guided treatment as against the wavefront optimized treatment, Dr. Rajesh?
In majority of cases, I don't think there will be any difference in the regular, like Snellen visual acuity where you see between wavefront optimized or topo guided. But patients who have topographic abnormalities or induced high order aberrations, corneal aberrations, they will definitely see like asymmetric bow tie if somebody has. If you do a topo guided, definitely their contrast sensitivity and nighttime vision would be better. But if you just check with the usual Snellen acuity, you might find that both the patients have a similar response.
If you are all for a Contura or a topo guided way of management, in high refractive errors, to save the tissue, would you justify using wavefront optimized as against these topo guided treatments?
Yes, obviously, because topo guided does normalize the corneal topography, but sometimes, especially with higher errors, you can have residual refractive errors. So if your patient doesn't want to have a second treatment and you want to achieve good outcomes, then maybe a wavefront optimized would be the best way to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. We shall go on to our next speaker, Dr. Shreyas Ramamurthy, who is going to tell us points to ponder on phakic IOLs in keratoconus. Dr. Gaurav, yes, I'll remember you are there. I'll ask you the next question. You have to unmute yourself, Shreyas. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I had unmuted myself. I think they had muted everyone. Yeah. So essentially, when do we perform phakic IOL in keratoconus patients? Either patients who have stable keratoconus or already have been cross-linked and are now stable. Patients with good spectacle corrected visual acuity, that's extremely important. And then about whether they have a centered or decentered cone, which I will deal with in subsequent slides. So we follow generally either if it's a patient is already having stable keratoconus because of age beyond 30, or if it's cross-linked, you wait for at least 2 stable refraction and 2 stable topographies with a minimum of 6 months or maybe more before you would contemplate a toric phakic intraocular lens. So for a patient with progressive keratoconus stabilized by cross-linking, if it's a central cone with good spectacle corrected visual acuity, then you could either do a cross-linking with the topo-guided PRK, and then for the residual error, go ahead with toric phakic IOL. But if the patient has an eccentric cone or the best spectacle corrected visual acuity is poor, then these patients are very poor candidates for any kind of phakic IOL procedure. So you would probably do well to do with the intracorneal ring segments, especially if the pachymetry is poor. The pachymetry is good, you could also try a topo-guided treatment and see if the BCVA improves. And if it improves, then you could subject them to a phakic IOL. So I'll just run you through a couple of quick examples. This is a patient with a very mild early KC, which was just observed. But the fellow eye of this patient had a more advanced keratoconus. Though it's a central cone, the best corrected visual acuity is very poor. But because of this kind of significant anisometropia, this patient cannot wear spectacles. And these are excellent candidates for introducing a phakic intraocular lens. But contrast that to a patient who has only a 624 best spectacle corrected visual acuity. For these patients, CXL alone and the thickness is quite low, so you can't do any other ablative procedure on the cornea. These are good candidates for Intacs. And once you've done the Intacs, you can see that the cone has become a far more regularized. The spectacle corrected visual acuity has improved to 6.9. And now you could subject them to a phakic intraocular lens. And with a phakic intraocular lens, post Intacs also, it works extremely well. It's very important that we ensure that we have a repeatable refraction. Patients who are not comfortable with their spectacle corrected visual acuity will not be happy with a phakic intraocular lens. And that is something we must remember during this treatment. Specific issues with regards to phakic IOL in keratoconus, these patients will have an abnormally high central anterior chamber depth, and therefore their white to white diameter, which can accurately be measured, will not correlate with their central anterior chamber depth like in normal patients. So there is a poor capacity to predict the peripheral anterior chamber, predict the central vaulting. As we all know, the ratio between the central anterior chamber depth and the peripheral anterior chamber depth is altered in keratoconus. So you can have a patient with the same white to white, but very different vaults, or you could have a patient with a similar vault, but you can see that the angle is wide open in one case and quite narrow in the other. In extreme scenarios, you could have the phakic intraocular lens actually popping above the pupil and actually having a kind of an optic capture because of the high vault. And in these cases, you have no other choice but to explant this and go ahead with a slightly smaller sized lens. So the caveats that I would like to highlight here is that patients with a higher ACD go for one size smaller than what you would in a normal refractive procedure. These patients may need customized lenses. Avoid contact lens users because they are generally very unhappy with spectacles or phakic IOLs. Vision less than 612, again, they are not very happy. I'll conclude in a minute. I'll just take you all through. You could also do this post-DALK when they are, once the sutures are out and they have a fairly regular astigmatism and good spectacle corrected visual acuity. The procedure can be done post-DALK as well, and it will be quite useful. So we did a study of about 126 eyes, a retrospective study of patients who have undergone phakic IOL in keratoconus. We used toric ICL and IPCL. All were stable keratoconus patients. As you can see here, the age group is a little older than the regular refractive cohort at the age of around 30. The Kmax, again, not very advanced keratoconus, around 54. What is heartening is 80% of patients were within half a diopter of spherical equivalent and 90% were within plus or minus 1 diopter. These are all keratoconus patients, which is a good outcome. And patients beyond 6/9 vision, 70% pre-op BCVA, but 86% post-op BCVA. 39% of patients gained one or more lines of best corrected visual acuity with the phakic intraocular lenses. We also did a quick subset analysis of low astigmatism versus high astigmatism and found high astigmatism patients did just as well. Both ICL and IPCL patients did very well. Even patients with a decentered cone, as long as their spectacle corrected visual acuity was good, we found that the outcomes with central as well as decentered cones were equally good. So with appropriate case selection, good BSCVA, and appropriate sizing, we can give optimal results in these situations as well. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Resh, for a very crisp talk. While Dr. Ramuti is sharing his screen, I'm going to have two questions, one to Gaurav and one to Rajesh and Shreyas. Patient is in the late 20s, Dr. Gaurav. He's come for a refractive correction. Are you there?
Yes, yes.
Refractive correction. So can you go ahead and do a phakic IOL alone and follow up the patient, or would you consider CXL along with it?
So I would not along with it, but if a patient is having
Along with it, I meant.
I understand what you meant. So I would definitely look at first stability of the keratoconus. I would not go with the ICL straight away. I mean, even if I have a suspect cornea, I'll want to follow it up to see whether there's changes in the topography and the refraction happening. And only as Shreya said, I'm satisfied over 6 monthly, 2 or 3 visits, and maybe even more. Only then I would do it. I would not jump to first implanting the ICL and cross-linking. Even cross-linking alone can cause flattening of the cornea over a period of time and change the refraction and even the astigmatism. So I don't think that's a great idea.
Shreyas, your thoughts?
No, I just wanted to say that it is not necessary that every keratoconus has to be cross-linked. So if a patient who is late 20s, early 30s, already you've been seeing this patient for quite some time, it has been a stable keratoconus. So just because you want to subject them to a phakic IOL, it is not necessary they have to be cross-linked. That was the point I was trying to highlight. And you could, if the real rare scenario that these patients progress later after a phakic IOL, you could cross-link them later. Of course, like Gaurav sir said, some of these patients can go on to develop more flattening and haze from cross-linking. But fortunately, with the accelerated protocols nowadays, we don't see as much significant flattening over a prolonged period of time. Rare cases, yes.
One question to you, Dr. Rajesh. When would you consider implanting a phakic IOL in a post-DALK patient? Is it after removal of all sutures or earlier?
Yeah, after removing all the sutures and ensuring a stable topography. So I would say that even after suture removal, at least 3 months post. So we do topography then only when the topography is stable. Because if you don't have a stable refraction, you are unlikely to have a great outcome.
Right. Any other question you all have in mind, Dr. Rajesh or Shreyas, to ask before, because Ramurthy is going to be the last speaker. I'm giving up my talk because I think we have to close down at 5:25 for the inauguration. So anything else to ask on this very interesting topic?
No, I think what point he has made is very valid, both Shreyas and Gaurav. I think people should not implant toric ICL in patients with keratoconus who don't have good spectacle corrected visual acuity. Often we see patients who have keratoconus, best spectacle corrected of 624, and they have a toric ICL in the eye. And then when they come back, then to manage these cases, it becomes really problematic. So for me, if I have a patient who's 6'9" or better, which indicates that they have good quality vision with spectacle, then only we think about the option of doing a toric ICL.
The only point.
Yeah, it's an off-label approach. It's not recommended by the company. So you have to take that into consideration whenever you are doing it for your patient.
I think just one observation I would like to add is, generally we thought that if it's a decentered cone, then we are not going to take up these patients for toric IPCL or ICL. But what Shrey showed and what we felt was that, even in these decentered cones, if the patient is having the best spectacle corrected visual acuity of 6'9" or better, you go ahead and implant these lenses till they seem to do well.
Correct. Even if the cone is decentered, if you go and see the power distribution in the pupillary area, often there is not too much of asymmetry within the pupillary area. So the patient can, so you basically not rely on your optometrist, but you have to verify that yourself, that the patient does see 6'9" with the glasses and he's happy with the quality of vision, because that's what he's going to get.
Thank you. We go on to our last speaker, Dr. Ramurthy, who's going to dwell on treatment of higher grades of hyperopia, choosing between laser vision correction and clear lens extraction with multifocal IOLs.
Thank you so much, Chitra and team ARC. I think the classification of hyperopia is as low, less than 2 diopters, medium 2 to 4 diopters, high beyond 4 diopters. This is and I believe that laser vision correction for high hyperopia is not even a consideration. Today, I won't do for high hyperopia beyond 2.5 diopters laser vision correction, because when you do it in higher grades, then you can get undercorrection, regression of whatever effect you get, poor quality of vision because the hyperprolate cornea that you leave behind. Because the nipple-like effect, the ocular surface issues with these cases is much more pronounced than even with myopia. Basically, as far as I'm concerned, as by treating high hyperopia, less than 45 years of age, if the lens is pristine, then it will be phakic intraocular lenses. If it's beyond 45 years and the patient is keen on a lens base on getting rid of the refractive error, it would be more cataract lens extraction with multifocal intraocular lens. Again, of course, if the AC depth is less than 2.8 millimeters, lens-based surgery might be a better way to go. The reasons we have, there is renewed interest and greater interest in laser vision lens extraction for hyperopia, higher grades of hyperopia, is because of our ability to accurate biometry, even these extremes of refractive error, excellent post-surgical visual outcomes that we are able to achieve with current technologies, availability of premium intraocular lenses, the torics, the trifocal torics, etc. And many people well beyond their 40s leading a very active lifestyle and wanting to get rid of their glasses. And other side effects of removing the lens is that the shallowing of the AC, which is often concomitant with these cases, is something done away with. Unlike in higher grades of myopic errors, the increased risk of retinal detachment, CME, CNVM, etc. are not there in these cases, high hyperopia. And minimal induction of HOA, unlike in laser vision correction, which would happen if we were to correct high grades of hyperopia on the cornea. The only consideration would be that high hyperopia sometimes is associated with choroidal effusion. This has also been titrated with the sclerochoroidal complex thickness, but with the controlled phacoemulsification, this is less of a problem. We must understand that even though the lens might be clear, the lens of a 25-year-old is not exactly the same as that of a 55-year-old. And with aging, even if the lens is clear, there's an increase in spherical aberration, light scattering, refractive index. There's a decrease in transparency and accommodation, because of which it's a dysfunctional lens. And there is an index which is being talked about. I'm not going to go into details. Anything less than 5 is considered to be a dysfunctional lens. And especially if it's associated with high grades of hyperopic refractive error, the patient might benefit from exchanging these lenses. Just a couple of videos. One is a refractive lens exchange with the EDOF, another is a refractive lens exchange with a trifocal. Basically, you would observe all the precautions that you would for a clear lens extraction. The basic challenge is in accurate biometry. As far as you're able to get those numbers right, often you end up with good refractive outcome. In some cases of extreme refractive errors, this was a case which had an error of 49 diopters, implanted a plus 40 diopters, residual as plus 6, and this was a planned Sulcoflex lens which was implanted a month later. And you can see the simple calculation is for every diopter of correction of hyperopia, you require 1.5 diopters. So basically what went in this case is a plus 9 diopters, bilaterally implanted. This patient, even with extreme hyperopia, ended up with almost an emmetropic outcome. Again, you have this option of secondary trifocal implantation also. There are patients who have already had a monofocal implant done, and today we have the choice of implanting a Sulcoflex lens or a piggyback lens. There are reasonably good lenses that are available even in the Indian market, making it affordable and ability to rehabilitate these patients as far as the requirement of the near vision is concerned. And as regards our study, I still have a minute. So as regards our study in the year 2019, we did 28 days of clear lens extraction. 14 of them, obviously all these cases are done bilaterally, and the mean age was 51. The age range was between 42 to 61. As far as the majority of these patients are hyperopic patients, 13 of them, just one patient was a myope. The multifocal intraocular lenses we used in 24 of these eyes. 4 were just multifocals, EDOF in 8. And the later part of our studies, it was mostly trifocal, because that's what we're shifting to. Trifocal toric in 2 eyes. And you can see the significant, excellent refractive outcome majority of these patients had. So the disadvantages of this particular surgery is the complication that always goes in hand with any invasive surgery. The chances of posterior capsular opacification, endophthalmodonosis, and CME and retinal detachment, though in hyperopic cases, that's extremely small. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
I'll see if we can take 2 questions. Anagha or Satyajit could also add, would you think of combining cross-linking when you're doing a hyperopic classic? Moderate grades of hyperopic classic. Would you all want to consider cross-linking? Because I was to cover that in the regression talk, but it's not done. So, Anagha, are you there? Dr. Satyajit? Okay, right. Dr. Gaurav, Anagha, you're there. Would you think of combining with cross-linking when you're doing moderate hyperopic laser vision correction?
No, not at the same sitting, ma'am.
You do not believe that combining it with laser vision correction with CXL will do good for a regression in a hyperopic classic? Don't believe that.
No, not at the same sitting. Maybe at another next sitting. In the next sitting.
How would that?
How would that?
So, ma'am, actually, I think Kanalopoulos is the one who has done the maximum work on this and published about it, and he strongly believes that this works well. But nobody else has been able to really reproduce. I don't know if anybody else has published on this or is strongly proper. Is a proponent. I think you will be best to talk on this, and maybe Dr. Fogla has experience on this.
Yes, Dr. Fogla.
I agree with Dr. Ramamurthy. I don't believe in LASIK for hyperopia.
Yes.
Unless up to 2 diopters, maybe I would do. Anything beyond that, it doesn't work. And especially with a lot of regression and patients are not happy. And also, you would find that a lot of these patients already have a steep K of around 45, 46. And if you do a hyperopic treatment, you are basically taking the corneal curvature beyond the physiological limits, and which does have an impact. And so maybe a lens-based approach would be, especially in presbyopic patients, definitely a lens-based approach is good. Having said that, but in children, if you see, 10, 12-year-old children who have +5, +6, so there sometimes we do a hyperopic LASIK, but not from the point of, because from the point of amblyopia management, you can definitely think about doing as a therapeutic treatment, you can perform hyperopic laser procedures.
Even in these situations, I think if there's adequate AC depth, I would consider it a phakic IOL.
Yeah, but any thoughts on cross-linking with hyperopic LASIK?
We want to hear your thoughts, ma'am.
No, I'll go on to the next question. I don't think it can be ruled out at all if the anterior chamber depth is less and the hyperopia is just about 3 diopters, and you don't want to do a clear lens exchange in this patient. I think there is no harm in doing combining with CXL. Although we prefer to do a CXL with a PRK largely because that only makes sense. But definitely, I'm not convinced that CXL has no role at all in regression. There are enough number of studies which say that it could be considered. It has been keeping the eye stable anyway. There is one.
Right, Dr. Chitra, it's already 5:25. We might get logged out at any time. So
yeah, we are ready
just
for
to
that.
inform.
Yeah, beyond thank you, we are talking.
Waiting for the hacks to fall.
Yeah, if you have a thick epithelium, say 70 micron of epithelium, a person has, you are planning an enhancement in these eyes. So what would you do for these patients? Would you do a flap lift? The patient is actually come for enhancement after 5 years. Would you go ahead and do a PRK for these patients? Or
looks like only Dr. Chitra got logged out.
Only Dr. Chitra got logged out. We all are still here. I think Dr. Ramamurthy should continue the thing till we all get kicked out.
We can talk about other things here. Anyway, I think if it is 70 micron, as she mentioned, the first thing I'll do is to just debride the epithelium and see what impact it has on the refractive outcome. Before doing
Definitely no trans-PRK because that will cause irregular ablation of the epithelium, and so trans-PRK is definitely, but alcohol or like brush or something, I would still go ahead and do a surface thing. I don't know what others would think.
Especially treating very low myopia, it's always better to debride epithelium and do a PRK, especially if you don't have the epithelial maps. Because I've had a situation where I treated -0.75 and the patient didn't have any effect at all. And that was because the patient's epithelium was about 65 microns. So whatever I ablated, it was all intraepithelial as well. So when the patient came back, we did a manual debridement of the epithelium and then performed the PRK, and then then the effect was seen. So I think, especially for enhancement also, if you're doing epithelial mapping becomes very important.
If it's an extremely thick epithelium like this, sometimes it's worthwhile just debriding the epithelium and looking at the refractive outcome in a couple of months. And of course,
sorry to come in between and cut you short. I received a call from organizing committee. As per the instructions, we have to get logged out. That's the call that I have received just now. So I would request everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. It was really great session.
Which hall should we log into? Which hall should we log into?
It's a visit link for inauguration hall. I would request you to please visit the link. You will be directed to the hall.
What is the name of the hall?
It's inauguration hall.
I'll guide you, Dr. Satyajit. Thank you very much, all of you, for being with us. It's very sad that this very interesting session with so many talks had to be closed down because of the wrong timing. We were not informed about the inauguration, but having said it, I think we had fair amount of discussions. Sorry, I could not involve more of you into the discussions, but thanks a lot for staying with me in this preferred practice guidelines. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.